What's going on, guys? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Apollo client queries in depth when using React and Apollo server. First, we're going to save ourselves some time by initializing a simple Apollo server, which I have saved in a GitHub project in the description. I'll talk more about that later. We're then going to set up the Apollo client for React. Then we are going to query data using the React hooks called useQuery and useLazyQuery alongside using variables when querying our server. We're also going to use the functionality of useQuery and useLazyQuery to manage successful response and error requests as well. We're also going to use the functionality of useQuery and useLazyQuery to manage successful responses and also manage errors if they come from our server. From there, we're going to explore the options that useQuery and useLazyQuery have for added functionality specific to whatever use case you have. So this video is a super in-depth guide for queries. Whether you're creating your own project or trying to manage a query for something at work, this video should be a great in-depth tutorial on how to manage querying to an Apollo server. Let's get started by setting up the Apollo server backend for my GitHub repo. So this is going to be the Apollo server backend that we are going to query. It's very simple. You're going to go in here and you're going to git clone this HTTPS. In the worst case, if you're very scared of Git, you can download the zip here, but I'll show you guys how to clone this repo in a second. Just to explain the functionality of the repo, it's pretty much a dog API where we're going to have a list of dogs defined in the API, and so we can get all the dogs like this. We'll have a dog named Bird, a dog named Presto, and a dog named Felix. And we're also going to be able to query a certain dog by name, so that's where variables come in. We're going to ask for a certain dog named Bert, and we're going to be able to get Bert's age, for example. This is a very simple API, but it puts the main focus on understanding the React components and also understanding the querying side from Apollo client. I'm going to start our project by going to an empty folder in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to open up the terminal, then I'm going to git clone that backend that we're going to use. So inside of this dog API folder, we can cd dog API to get into that folder right there. This is going to be all of our backend code. You don't have to understand the backend code, but just to give you guys a basic idea, we have this data dogs, and we're going to be able to query this data. The two queries are getting all the dogs and getting a certain dog by name. To start the server, you're going to first want to npm install to get all the packages for the backend. Then I'm also going to npm start. This is going to start our backend. So now we have a backend Apollo server hosted locally for us to use. Now we can get started by creating the React part of the project. I'm going to split the terminal here. On the left side is going to be the Apollo server. We're not going to change any of the logic in this entire video, but I'm just going to keep it here to show you guys that the server is still running so no one gets confused. On the right side, we're going to do the commands to start our React project. When you initialize your React project, you want to make sure you're on this outermost folder. So you don't want to be inside the dog API because we're going to have all of our backend in one folder and then all of our frontend in another folder. For example, my initial folder was Apollo client queries video. So I'm going to go in here and then I'm going to npx create React app, and I'm just going to call the application frontend. All right, so now our frontend has been fully created. We can go on the right here and say cd frontend to go into the folder where our React project lives. You can open up the frontend folder here. I'm going to close this index.js because we're not going to be looking at the backend, and I'm going to open up our index.js of our frontend application. That's why I make that little aside. You want to make sure you're in the index.js of the frontend. I'm going to first start by npm installing the Apollo client so we can use it in React. So let's npm install at apollo/client. This allows us to use all the different Apollo client functionality, especially the stuff we're going to need for setup right now. First, we're going to import all the necessary packages, and I'll explain why we're importing each one as we do it. We're going to first need the Apollo client. This is the actual client that your React application uses to make requests to an Apollo server. Then we're going to need an in-memory cache. This is one of the more default data caches for the Apollo client. We're not going to be doing any caching in this video. It's kind of just recommended in the Apollo server documentation. Then we're going to need the Apollo provider. The Apollo provider is an element that's going to wrap around our app to give our application actual access to the Apollo client, which I'll show you guys in a second. We're also going to need create HTTP link. This allows our Apollo client to talk to an HTTP link. For example, HTTP localhost 4000. So let's get started by creating that link. We can say const link is equal to create HTTP link. This is going to take in a couple options as to what you want the link to be. We want the URI of the link to be the URI of our backend. So for example, HTTP //localhost 4000. And this is a simple link. That's all we need to do. Then we need to create our actual Apollo client. We can do this by saying const client is equal to new Apollo client And similarly, Apollo client requires some parameters to get built as well. It's going to ask for a cache, which we can make a new in-memory cache. And it's also going to ask a link. So whenever this Apollo client talks to Apollo server, how do we communicate with what certain link? We can use this HTTP link we made up here. So we can say link is equal to this link const we made at line 13. And so this is a great start, but our React application doesn't actually have access to Apollo client quite yet. This is where the Apollo provider comes in. It's an element that we can add right here, and we want to put our app on the inside of this element. And the Apollo provider is going to take in one property, which is going to be the client. It's saying, okay, we want to provide this Apollo client to whatever's on the inside here. For example, at line 26, that's going to be your entire application. So if you ever use the Apollo client in any area in your application, it's going to use this certain client right here, which is going to be using this link right here, which is going to be localhost 4000. That's an overview of how all this stuff works together, even though it's just set up. This is good to understand though, because sometimes it can seem like magic as to why your Apollo client queries are going through. It's because if we ever make a query on the inside of this application, it's using the client that we defined here, kind of in the background. All right, but now our client is fully initialized. We can head over to app.js to get started on our first queries. Let's start by just doing a little npm start and seeing what our React application looks like. All right, so we have the boilerplate React application, which is exactly what we'd expect, but we don't really need any of this stuff. I'm just going to get rid of everything within the header, and I'm just going to make an h1 that says dog API query app. All right, so let's go check for those changes. All right, we're looking good. This application isn't going to have a lot of functionality in the front end, but we're just going to be displaying the data that we receive from our queries to the page. So I'll show you guys how we do that in a second. So let's get started on creating our first query to our backend. So in order to make GraphQL queries, we actually need to use the GQL language. We can get GQL by importing GQL from the Apollo client. This allows us to kind of speak in GraphQL. Because remember, we're in JavaScript. We can't just switch to GraphQL right away. We need to get some type of outside information, such as a GQL package, to start speaking in GraphQL. We're also going to use the useQuery hook. As you'll see, it's even mentioning this. I will show you guys useLazyQuery in a different part of this video. But we're just going to start by making a simple query. To start by thinking about how we can create queries, I am going to head over to our backend. So my backend's hosted on localhost 4000. If you copy my Git code, yours should also be on the same port, but just make sure you go to localhost 4000 and then query your server. So inside of the Apollo server sandbox, we can take a look at how we can actually create these queries. For example, we can take a look at query here. If I want to make a getAllDogs query, I can press the plus button next to this field, and then I can also press the plus button as to what fields do I want to get back. For example, the name and the age of the dogs. And I can run this query from the sandbox itself and get data. As you can see, we have 3 dogs, Bert, Presto, and Felix. So in this video, we are going to set up our React application so we can make the exact same query. We can start by copying this query code right here. Because this query code is GraphQL, we can copy it and bring it over to our React application to use for a query from our front end. So copy this code and let's go back to React. We are going to start by defining our query name. For example, const get_all_dogs. We are then going to use GQL, which is the thing we imported right here, and then backticks. That means within these backticks, we are now speaking GraphQL. We're not speaking JavaScript anymore. And we can just copy paste this getAllDogs query that we made in the sandbox. The sandbox is a super helpful tool. Once you make a query in the sandbox, you can go bring it over to your front end just like this. And so now we have a defined GraphQL query, at least the syntax of it, except we're not calling the query yet. You could imagine it's like a function. You can make a function, but you never actually get the result of the function until you call it. And so now we have to use useQuery to call the actual getAllDogs query. So useQuery is something called a React hook, which gives us access to functionality beyond just React. It's going to give us access to a couple of different variables provided to us by useQuery. It's going to give us access to the loading property. It's going to give us access to the error property and the data property. There are also other properties, but for our first simple query, I'm just going to get these 3 main ones. And so this first parameter of the useQuery hook is asking for an actual GraphQL query. Good for us, at line 5, we've fully defined a GraphQL query for it to use. And so this is actually great news. And so if any of these variables change, for example, loading, error, or data, it's going to re-render your application. We can use that re-rendering logic to kind of make clauses if something happens. For example, if loading exists, that means that it's currently loading, so we're just going to return null instead of returning our application. If an error exists, we are going to instead return error, and I'm going to actually just use the error here. And so if we get to line 20, that means that loading doesn't exist and error doesn't exist, which means data is going to show up. For now, I'm just going to console.log data here. And to get rid of these warnings, we can go and remove this logo from line 1. All right, looks better now. Okay, just to explain what's happening one more time, this useQuery gets ran as soon as the application starts. It's going to get the data from getAllDogs as soon as possible, and it's going to show loading, error, and data. And so as soon as data shows up, loading won't exist and error won't exist, and so these if statements won't get entered, and we will have the data we can use. If we go to our React application, we should see a console.log of whatever data is getting returned from this query. So let's go to our application and check that out. All right, so in our application, we see that the data object is getting logged, so we can get a good idea as to what data looks like. It's showing the getAllDogs property here. Inside of getAllDogs is 3 different objects, which is all the dogs that we'd expect. A 0 dog, a 1 dog, and a 2 dog. This means that from our front end, we are querying and getting data from our backend. And it's running as soon as our application runs. So for example, I can refresh this again and we can show it again. Boom. So it's always going to show up as soon as possible. Sometimes you don't want the data to show up as soon as possible, right? That can become an issue. And so let's say we wanted to do some type of processing with the data that showed up. We can use something called onCompleted. onCompleted allows us to add functionality to our React application when the useQuery gets done. So when our query is complete and we want to actually do certain things with our data, you could imagine having a bunch of logic at line 21 might look messy, especially if you have a bunch of different queries, you know? And so onCompleted allows you to put actual React logic inside of a callback function. The callback function has one parameter, which is just the query data I'm going to call for this video. We could define the function by using an arrow here, using some curly brackets, and now within these curly brackets is any functionality we want. So I'm going to remove the console log at line 23, and I'm going to instead console.log the query data we have here. Let's refresh our application and see if we still have a console log. Amazing. So as you can see, when our query gets completed, it's hitting this callback function and it's going to line 17 and it's running the logic to show the getAllDogs here. So if I wanted to, just get the property of getAllDogs from the query data, I could do .getAllDogs like this. So let's go check this out. So now we actually have access to this array. And so let's say we wanted to create some type of logic when working with the data. For example, you're a software as a service application, and for every single thing in an array, you want to process the data in a certain way to your front end. I'm not going to do anything crazy in this video, but we can console.log and make a very simple statement with the data that we've received. For example, we can get that array of dogs by saying const dog array is equal to query data.getAllDogs. We can then make a for loop to go through this dog array. So I'm going to say for let I is equal to 0, while I is less than dog array dot length, we're going to increment I. Simple for loop logic here. And then since we're in a certain part in the dog array, we can kind of reference that dog, right? So I'm going to say the name of the dog is a certain amount of years old. Dog array of that certain index dot name. So you can imagine that first dog's name is, then we can get the dog's age. Dog array of I dot age years old. So for example, Bert is 10 years old. I know this seems very simple, but you could imagine if you wanted more complicated logic, this is where it could all happen. I'm just giving a very basic example. And so let's go over to our React application. Amazing. So now we can kind of create unique statements. And I know this is very simple, guys, but we can create unique statements based off the data that we are receiving from our query. And importantly, we can make all this logic once our query has been fully completed. We're using GraphQL. And so let's say we wanted to get all the dogs, but we just wanted all the dogs' names. We could totally just get rid of this name in our request. But you can see, for how we currently have the functionality, we kind of want to show the name, right? But I'm just giving you guys an example of how GraphQL can help you out. Is like, sometimes you don't need that name data for your front end, and so you don't even have to call for it. That's the great part about GraphQL. And so this is as far as I'm going to go for this query example, because we're going to get into something just a little bit more complicated. We are going to try and query using variables and trying to get a certain dog and showing a certain dog's age and just a certain dog's block of data if you wanted to add more stuff to the backend. We can start by creating this query in a similar way to how we created this getAllDogs query. We can go to our localhost 4000 backend. And if you guys are confused as to how you get to the sandbox again, if you're running your Apollo server locally, just go to localhost 4000 and then press query your server and you'll get to the same spot as me. But for this example, we don't want to do getAllDogs, we want to do getDog, which is another query in our backend. This time it's going to take arguments, and I wanted to use this example for this tutorial because arguments are very important. And this time it's only going to get one dog, and so we can get a basic idea of what the query is going to be by using this logic here. Then in our variables, we're going to have an object down here, and let's say I want to get the dog named Bert. I can then put the variables down here, have the query up here, and then getDog, boom. I can get the information for a certain dog. For example, if it's a dog that doesn't exist, everyone has a dog named Cooper, it seems, but there's no Coopers in this data in our backend. And so we're going to get an error, and it's actually an error that we want to get from our backend. It's going to say, no dog with name Cooper, and we're going to get a code, dog doesn't exist. So we're also going to have some cool error handling we can do as well. And so take this query that we created here, and then go back to your React application. We can go up here and do a const get_dog by name is equal to GQL. And then we can copy in that GQL we created earlier. And just for this tutorial, I'm actually going to comment out our other queries so we can still use a simple loading error in data, for example. All right, so I'm just going to comment out this for now. And so I'm going to go under here and I'm going to get started on creating our next query. So we can kind of copy what's been commented so far, and it's going to be a use query. We're going to want to close it up like this, and we're referencing this getDog by name, so copy this, bring it down. But there is something interesting about this query we didn't use before. There is a variable called name. And so the interesting thing that's true among a lot of these different JavaScript libraries, so if you guys want to look out for a certain pattern to know about, is that we have this options object. This options object also allows us to pass in variables. And you might be like, how does this variables get formatted? Well, here's a great thing to look at. If you go back to your backend, and you don't have to do this because I'll just show you guys, variables is referencing an object like this. This is the actual JSON behind the variables. So we can actually copy this thing here and bring it over to where we want to define the variables. For example, right here. In this case, I'm going to have it be a property like this, and I'm going to have it be hard-coded to the name Bert. So we're going to be searching for the name Bert, but I'll show you guys how to use text inputs in a second. And so let's also create an onCompleted here. Because this is a query, we can still do an onCompleted, and you can see how Apollo Client's nice because it allows you to expand with multiple different things. For example, variables, onCompleted, even error handling as well. And so I'm going to do the same thing. We want to make sure we create a callback function here. I'm going to call it query data. And I'm going to do an arrow here. And then I'm going to console.log that data we're getting back from our API. So similar example. And so let's go to our React application and check out what's happening. So we can see we're actually getting some query data for this getDog, which is actually amazing. So it can show us all the different variables related to dog. For example, if you were searching your API trying to get a certain piece of data, you could have way more attributes here just beyond the age. But we inputted just the dog's name, and now we're able to see that the dog is 10 years old, for example. The interesting thing here is, let's put in the name Cooper. We got an error when we were handling this before, and so let's go in and see what happens on our front end. You'll see nothing is happening. The reason is because onCompleted is only when it successfully completes a request is a very important thing to know. We have this error object here that we can use to manipulate the front end if we ever get an error. So look at this. If I console.log error here and go back to our application, we can see we are getting a very interesting error where it says no dog with the name Cooper. And this is actually something we can display to our user. But the interesting thing about this error is in a similar way to handling a successful request, we can also create certain logic to handle error requests. We can do an on error as to opposed to a, query data. And so I can say error here. I'm going to say error data so we don't use that same const twice. And it's a very similar thing. It's going to be a callback function. And so we can console.log the error data here. And so although our app is showing us the same thing, it's interesting because what's happening is it's actually hitting that on error callback function at line 46. Similar to how we can create unique logic for when a query is completed successfully, we can also create unique logic for when a query is errored successfully, if that makes sense. If we see an error, it's going to give us that error to the front end. I'm also going to show you guys how you can make like dynamic variables. For example, making the name equal to a certain text input. Let's scroll to the top of our application and I want to import useState from React. useState is going to allow us to create a text input. If you guys are interested in a video covering a more generic JavaScript stuff like useState, I can definitely do that. But let's define our state by saying const dog input and then the set dog input. This is a very simple just useState example where I want a string input, so I'm going to make a string state. And so we can set this state equal to whatever the user inputs by creating a very simple text input. So input type is equal to text. Then on change, we can actually call a function with the event, and we can set the dog input here equal to the e.target.value. This allows us to get the text value directly from the input. And so I'm just going to console.log whatever our dog input currently is. So as you guys can see, if I put in Cooper, it's going to show Cooper here. Or if I put in hello world, it's going to show hello world. So there you guys go. Not exactly a useState tutorial, but it's going to help us make some cool functionality. If I want this variable name input to be whatever the user inputs, I don't want our query to run right away anymore. I obviously would want the user to, I would want to like wait for the user's inputs to run our queries. And I'll make like a button or something to run the query. So we can change this useQuery into a useLazyQuery. The only difference between useQuery and useLazyQuery is useLazyQuery does not run right away. It waits. And because of that, it gives you a function so you can call the query manually. And so the syntax for what you're receiving from useLazyQuery kind of changes. It's going to give you an array, and it's going to have the first part of the array, kind of like useState, but the first part is going to be the function to use this useLazyQuery. I'm just going to say getDog data, because we're kind of getting a certain dog's data by their name, for example. And this second parameter here is all the other stuff that we normally just get from useQuery anyways. It's kind of how useLazyQuery adds on top. All right, so now that we have all the inputs set up, the variables are kind of going to change. This is the strange thing about Apollo is sometimes how you call things or do things isn't exactly intuitive. For example, if we take our state we just made and put it in the variable name Cooper here, like this, it is going to run our lazy query whenever the state value changes after we run the query once. It's kind of weird logic. And so how we get around this is we can create a button. And when we click this button, we're going to want to have some onClick code that calls the function to call our query, so getDog data. Except in here, we are going to manually define the variables from where our button is. This is going to prevent our app from constantly refreshing. And so in here, we can define that variables object where it's an opening object here, like this, and then it has a name with the dog input like such. And so we can remove the variables that we have here because they're instead getting passed in when we call the getDog data. Instead of being a part of the query itself by being part of the useLazyQuery hook, we're instead passing in the variables every single time we call the query right here. And so we can say in the button here, getDog data by name. So as you can see right away, we don't have any calls here, which is great because we're using that lazy query. So if I entered in the name Bert, press that here, I can then go see that I'm getting the information from Bert, which is actually super great. And this console.log is coming from line 42, which means our query was successfully completed. If I look up Cooper, for example, which is not a dog we have in our database, I'm then going to get an error saying no dog with the name Cooper. And so this is actually super great. We can also do one of the dogs that does exist in our database to show you a different example outside of Bert, like Felix. It's going to give us that getDog, and it's going to show us Felix, and he has an age of 3. This is a really cool example because it shows that we can use variables to create unique GraphQL queries through Apollo Client. This video is not supposed to be in-depth in any regard, but it's supposed to show you guys how to get started when querying your GraphQL server. If I have any advice for anyone getting started with the GraphQL querying, is that start simple when you think about the APIs you're creating. Are you loading in all the data for a certain user? What does that query look like? And you'll see it kind of is nice. You can stack up these queries and use the data as you'd like. For example, if I wanted to query all the users' data, I could go, maybe you have some type of authentication, for example, and I would have a key. I could then go to my backend, get all the users' data, which I'm obviously simplifying a lot, but get all the users' data, and then inside of an onCompleted, for example, I could kind of fill out my front end with all the data that it's going to need. And I could create a component showing the user's profile, for example, with all their different information. I'm just kind of giving some commentary at the end of the video here to explain how powerful this is, because although it's simple, it really does give you guys the building blocks you need in order to create full, interesting React applications with Apollo Client. If you guys are interested in a more advanced query video, for example, manipulating React components based off of data, working with multiple different components, and each component has its own query, something along those lines, let me know in the comments. I don't really know how interested people are in this topic specifically, so let me know. Hopefully this tutorial was interesting and it was, helpful for your React projects, especially your Apollo Client projects. And thanks so much for watching.